Tonight, I am on stage telling you my story. But I know that every single one of you here in the room with me has a story of their own to tell. You have a story. It's a story of the challenges that you have faced. It's a story of the pain and the setbacks that you have overcome. It's a story of the achievements that you have made so far in your lives. If you can find the courage to open up, to speak out to the world about these personal challenges, about the hurdles that you have overcome, if you can tell that story, then you can find and create a community of people who share your values. And together you can act with that community to change the world. I'm here to tell you how your story becomes our story. I am here to tell you that if we can tell our story, we can act together as communities to meet all of the challenges that face us. I have a story for you. 2 years ago, I woke up to election results in the country where I was born, the United States. Results that made me sick to my stomach. They were election results that made me feel as if everything that was most important to me was under threat. As if the equality that women had won after so many years was under threat. As if the equality between immigrants and citizens, or the equality of people who are differently abled, or people belonging to any kind of minority whatsoever, was under threat. I saw these results as an attack on the progress that all Americans had made to extend the promise of health care to everyone who needed it. I saw them as an attack on America's commitment to address climate change and to stave off disaster. So, after 3 days of total despair, I decided to act. I joined together with a team. There were 7 of us in total, online across the world, in South Carolina and New York, in Toronto, London, Oslo, Geneva, and Sydney. We had never met before, but we were united by our common values. We perceived the same threats, and we decided together that we would fulfill a vision. It was a vision of a march of women and their allies across the international date line, from New Zealand to Hawaii, over 24 hours. We decided that this march, the Women's March, would take place not only in the US, where it originated, but across the entire planet. So what did we do? We had 10 weeks ahead of us. We began to organize. We joined together and were able to rally support and organizers across the globe. Just like the march you see behind me in Paris, we were able to organize marches in 200 cities in 84 countries outside of the US. Just the 7 of us in 10 weeks, with our determination and our stories, were able to identify, to recruit, and to empower organizers in these 200 cities across the globe in order to stand up for our values, for our belief that women's rights are human rights, for our belief in equality, in diversity, in inclusion, and in care for our planet. We spurred hope And we forged solidarity among these marchers. As I said, more than 1 million marchers outside of the US, and 5 million people marched around the world that day. We propelled women for the first time participating in these marches to become activists, to run for office, and to win political office. When we tell our stories, we create a shift in our listeners. We give them the ability, in listening to what we can recount about our pain, about our challenges, and how we have overcome these challenges. We give them the opportunity to access their own values, to identify with the values that we are telling our stories about through the emotion that they feel as they hear our story. And it's that emotion that then gives others the motivation that they need to act. Now, when I talk about emotions and motivation, I want you to know that there are good and bad emotions. That is to say, emotions that can inhibit us from acting together as communities, and emotions that can enable us to act together. So we can move from fear to hope as we tell our stories. As we tell our stories, we can move from isolation to solidarity. We can move from simply being apathetic to caring, to being passionate about change. And we can also move from self-doubt to the feeling that we can in fact make a difference. Women's marches are a wonderful example of mobilizing. That's what we do when we bring together people who agree with one another, and we show them their strength. We create solidarity, we create relationships, and we give them the opportunity to organize themselves. Organizing is when we create opportunities for people who don't agree to meet together, or for people who don't have the same level of awareness of the challenges that are being faced and the need to try and overcome those challenges. They access the power to act through the stories that we are able to tell them and the community that we create together. I have another story to share with you. It's a story that happened here in Russia. I need you to come back with me 20 years in time to 1998. I got a very unexpected phone call from a friend in St. Petersburg telling me that our mutual friend Olga was in the hospital and that her life was in danger. Olga had awoken one morning paralyzed from the neck down. The doctors had no idea what was wrong. As soon as I possibly could, I came to St. Petersburg to see Olga. I remember she was at home, she was lying in bed, and her mother was feeding her soup with a spoon. When I saw the situation with my own eyes, I immediately started crying. I felt absolutely helpless. I'm a person who's accustomed to taking action, but I just didn't know what I could do to make things better for Olga. I'm happy to say that her medical situation improved. After a few months, the paralysis left Olga's upper body. However, she remained paralyzed from the waist down, and I learned that she would be for the rest of her life. So I took another decision. I decided that I would trade places with Olga. What I mean is that I decided that I would do everything possible in order to help her adapt to this new life. Together with Olga, I began to understand what life is like for people with disabilities. and that as much progress has been made in our world, it's still people with disabilities who have to adapt themselves to society, and not society that adapts to them. Olga has made tremendous progress in adapting to this situation. Olga has been able to create a business from home, and she's been able to remodel her home so that it is accessible to her. I was inspired to take Olga's story and the power, the strength that Olga made me feel when I think about and look at her example, and to work with young people with disabilities in Russia. I believe that change starts with youth, and that it's very important that we provide opportunities to young people with disabilities in Russia to be able to create a more empathetic and compassionate society in which inclusion is real and not just a goal for the future. So once again, I decided that it was time to act. And what did I do? Well, here in Moscow, I joined together with a team of young adults with disabilities, and we created a program called Theatrical Perspectives. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It began back in 2012, and we used organizing tools in order to recruit 12 young people with disabilities aged 12 to 16. We recruited playwrights who spent a week with them in a summer camp near Moscow and taught them how to write plays. And then their plays were staged in Moscow at Mali Theater by 7 different directors and more than 50 actors and actresses to an audience of 700 people, a full house. Theatrical Perspectives is now in its 9th year of providing opportunities for young people with disabilities to have their voices heard, to express their innate creativity, to experience inclusion. So I began by telling you that we all have stories to tell. And I mentioned that when we tell our stories, we create a shift in our listeners, and that our listeners are able to access the emotions that can spur them to action in order to overcome challenges as communities. But there's something I left out, because when we find the courage, each and every one of us, to tell our own stories of overcoming challenges, then we also create a shift, and that shift is in ourselves. We become able to lead. We become able to act as role models for others, and we become able to create our own communities. So you've heard my stories this evening. My question for you is, what is the value that will push you to tell your story? And what of the many stories that you have to tell will you choose to share? What is the community that you will create around you by telling that story? And what is the challenge that you will ask that community to overcome together with you? My question for you is, what change will you create in the world? You've heard my story, and I thank you for listening to my stories. Now I'd like to know, what stories will you tell?